The great thing about organizing GRAE is that I had the opportunity to think about some colleagues that I had an opportunity to be in school with. So I was a little bit biased when I chose these two people because I use this as a reunion opportunity. And on top of that, they are also great. So that was a twofer. So tonight we have Courtney Wolfgang and Manisha Sharma, who will be doing the position of respondent, and tonight they'll have their presentations to share. So Dr. Wolfgang will start. Dr. Wolfgang, she, her, is an assistant professor in the Department of Art Education at Virginia Commonwealth University and a member of the VCU Open Minds faculty. Her research and teaching I got a PhD, but it's okay. The focuses include intersections of anti-racist, post-feminist, and queer theories with arts pedagogies, community-engaged pedagogies, and justice-oriented arts education practices. Recent publication sites include Visual Journal of Cultural Research and Art Education. Her chapter, Teacher Preparation During an Epidemic of Mass Incarceration, The Challenge and Hope of Arts and Education, appears in Critical Articulations of Hope from the Margins of Art Education, edited by Eva Antila and Anina Siomin. Okay. Recent and ongoing projects include collaborative arts-based workshops with adolescent girls in juvenile arbitration, development of arts courses for incarcerated adults at the City Jail in Richmond, Virginia, the Performing Statistics curriculum in the service of art ed, and queering art education. Dr. Sharma is an associate professor of art at the University of Arizona and past coordinator of the Caucus of Social Theory in Art Education. She examines how perceptions of culture and community are formed, internalized, and acted out through the production and consumption of art and visual culture artifacts. Her research foci include social justice art education, borderland pedagogies in South Asian contemporary art and visual culture. She's published and presented her research in peer-reviewed journals and books on art education and co-edited with Dr. Garber and Dr. Hotrick a book titled Makers, Crafters, Educators, Working for Cultural Change. She has served on several professional and editorial boards in the field, including Art Education, Journal of Social Theory in Art Education, Journal of Cultural Research in Art Education, and Visual Inquiry. And so first we have Dr. Wolfgang, who will be sharing her present research, her past research, all the things that show how great she is indeed. Yeah. No, you're great. You are. You came out of our cohort. I'm claiming this. So please help us welcome Dr. Wolfgang.
Oh my God, Joni is so much taller than me. Watch this. Hey. I'm going to, don't start my clock yet. I timed this. Capricorn rising. So I'm going to start by, the presentation view is not on. I can wing this part. I didn't start my timer. So I'm going to start, it's chill. I could probably talk about this without notes because, I did this, so we'll see. By talking about sort of the scope of the work that I do, usually when pressed for, that question like, what is your research about? I'm sort of all over the place. I'm also fixing my britches while I'm standing up here. I'm a little bit all over the place, but the shorthand that I give, like the elevator pitch when people ask me about my work, is I say that I'm just like deeply committed to thinking about equity and justice in the field of art education. And where those things situate themselves most of the time is this sort of concept of queering art education. Combating the school to confinement pipeline, also sometimes referred to as the school to prison pipeline, but when we're talking about school-aged folks, oftentimes incarceration is not the only way that they're pushed out of schools. It's home confinement. Whiteness, white supremacy, and racism, and the way that those things intersect. So I did this really annoying thing that I saw a well-respected colleague of mine do one time. I'm like, oh, I could probably do that. That looks pretty official. But so I included some of the sites of publication of some of this work. You'll see some familiar names up there. Jim Sanders was my advisor when I was here at OSU. And I have been working with Jim and Mindy Rhodes, who's also in the room, and Kim Kosher, and Manisha's been a part of this, but we've been involved in this performative group for the last, this year at NAE, it'll be the 11th year, called the Big Gay Church. And it arose, out of a sort of a need, a sort of felt need, and also an experienced need for those of us who have been in schools for addressing the erasure and the violence against queer, non-binary, trans students in schools, but also how the field of art education has failed those students, failed many of us in a lot of ways. And I also am guest editing an issue of VAR on Queering Art Ed that will come out this summer, so check it out. And then the next area that I've done some research, some work, I say the word research really lightly. I spoke to a class in gender studies at VCU earlier this week. And they're like, how did you choose these things as research sites? And the dirty secret is that I don't ever choose anything as a research site. I end up doing these projects and then I write about them afterward, but I've been really bad at sort of identifying, like, this is a research site and I'm gonna do this thing. So in that way, I'm a really bad academic. But I was a public school teacher prior to working in higher ed, and I worked in two very different schools and high schools, and was really started thinking about the disparity, especially amongst adolescents, as it relates to issues of like class, gender, sexuality. And when I was living in South Carolina, I taught at the University of South Carolina for a few years and became involved with a project with Olga Vashkovich where we did arts-based workshops for adjudicated youth in the summers. And overwhelmingly, I was seeing that the participants who we were working with, the children in some cases, all cases really, because they were under the age of 18, disproportionately Black and brown, almost always Black and brown students. And so I really started to think about, it's not a matter of criminality, it's a matter of policing. Like, who gets policed, and then who ends up in those spaces. And so I've written about that a little bit, but then the sort of practical element that I'm especially proud about is that along with a graduate student of mine from Virginia Commonwealth University, Tessney Stephen, a few years ago, we wrote a curriculum that's aligned with the Virginia Standards of Learning in collaboration with an arts organization in Richmond called Art 180. And it's called the Performing Statistics Curriculum, and it sort of like takes these concepts and takes these big ideas that are central to the issue of mass incarceration in the school-to-prison pipeline, and provides tools for teachers. It's aligned with the math, English, and arts curricula for the state of Virginia. And it's an arts-based curriculum that helps teachers sort of bring up these issues in classes. It's like a lot of the things that Melissa was saying during her talk were really resonant. Like, how do we just like get folks in the room to have difficult conversations? And so that's what that curriculum is about. And there's a link there. You can also just search Performing Statistics Curriculum if you're interested in checking it out. And then a lot of the work I do also sort of explores those intersections between issues of race, class, religion, sex, gender. I downloaded this from Google Docs and my image didn't download, so I just added the word glitch because it was supposed to be an image of, again, one of these workshops from the adjudicated youth. But within all of this, there has been a sort of repeated and underlying current that relates really, really directly to where it is that I'm living now, my experiences that I had as a child, as somebody who was in school, and also as a teacher. And that's what I'm going to talk about mostly now, and I'm going to try and do this in my 20 minutes. I'm going to read an excerpt from a recently published manuscript. It's not the manuscript in its entirety. I wouldn't have time for that. but I think it sort of captures the essence of it. This image is from Montgomery, Alabama. I didn't grow up in Montgomery. I actually grew up in Lower Alabama, LA, the southeastern corner, Dothan, the peanut and condom capital of the United States. But I was in Montgomery. My wife is from just outside of Montgomery. We were in Montgomery last year when I took this picture. This started as a more traditional manuscript, a critical investigation of my whiteness through philosophy, theory, and praxis. These tools were given to me with limited hesitation because of my whiteness. The intersections of my gender, I am a woman, and my sexuality, I am queer, produce challenges to access and credibility within the academy and the world. Ultimately, though, I can rely on my whiteness as privilege. Additionally, white supremacy relies on the normalization of that experience. Put another way, white people being unable or unwilling to see the social and cultural underpinnings of access is a function of white supremacy, and it is functioning well. So what I really want to discuss is white supremacy generally, and the white supremacy of art education specifically. This essay includes embedded resources throughout, and I have found these and others helpful in exploring white supremacy, confronting my part in white supremacy, acknowledging the unearned privilege I enjoy, and developing language with which to discuss related issues with students, colleagues, with family, and with friends. Lesson one that I have been taught is that we, meaning white and white presenting people, really have to do the work. So I'm sharing in my learning, but I'm not doing all of the work for you. In doing this, I hope my fellow white art educators in school, museum, and community spaces will read with open hearts and understand this not as a character assassination. Rather, this is our opportunity to acknowledge how legacies of racism and violence continue to deeply impact curriculum and pedagogy in the arts, to make space where we have failed in the past, and to reconsider pedagogy as a step toward reparation or mitigating the effects of white supremacy in art education on our students, our colleagues, and our communities. Race is a construct, and according to Alexander, a historically recent development owing largely to European imperialism. She continues, here in America, the idea of race emerged as a means of reconciling chattel slavery, as well as the extermination of American Indians, with the ideas of freedom preached by whites in the new colonies. We can point to a historical emergence of white supremacy following Bacon's Rebellion in 1675. A white property owner in Jamestown, Virginia, Nathaniel Bacon successfully united enslaved blacks, indentured servants, and poor whites against planter elite in the American colony. The rebellion effectively failed to overthrow the planter elite. In efforts to preserve their power, the planter elite extended privileges to poor whites to drive a wedge between them and black slaves, eliminating future alliances between enslaved blacks and poor whites, and establishing white supremacy as poor whites sought to expand their racial privilege. That's from Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. Whoops. Just kidding. According to Kuykendall, whiteness is predicated on the power to grant recognition and legitimacy. It exercises the right to impose meaning, objectives, and worldview on the racialized other, and so makes the issue of race undiscussable. What most people, especially white people, are taught to understand, either directly or indirectly, is that race isn't constructed but biological. A biological imperative of race was used to support the eugenics movement in the USA, where the desire to breed out so-called unwanted traits resulted in the forced sterilization of Native Americans, Mexican immigrants, and blacks in the South. If we consider the history of the construction of race and the reasoning behind its construction as a maintenance of power for white, wealthy landowners in the 17th century, then we can begin a process of unraveling the white supremacist power maintenance of race as it is intentionally violent toward black and brown bodies. Simply put, one's intention does not govern the response. If something one says or does hurts another person, that pain is not erased because one did not intend to hurt the other. The phrase do no harm is only an effective strategy when one can identify the harm one is doing. White supremacy relies on the cloaking of violence toward non-white persons as normalized. White supremacy in art education relies on the normalization of whiteness in arts curriculum and pedagogy, a normalization that is inherently violent. White people, fellow white people, if we are not willing to critically analyze what and how we were taught about the world, our intentions do not matter. If we are not willing to acknowledge what we achieve is always, at least in part, due to our unearned privilege of whiteness, our intentions do not matter. White teachers, if we cannot be truthful with ourselves about how white supremacy has influenced our teaching in order to actively combat the negative impact of white supremacy in art and education, we continue to enact violence on our students. Like many of you, I am trying to do the work. I am a former high school art teacher, now working at a university helping prepare future art educators. With a few exceptions related to job relocation and graduate school, go Bucks, I have spent the entirety of my white life in the Deep South of the United States of America. Presently, I live and work in the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. As a white person born to non-racist, but not actively anti-racist, white parents, living in the southeastern corner of Alabama, being white dramatically shaped my perception of self and the world around me. However, because we didn't talk about whiteness as a race or racism in general, I lived without explicit knowledge of how the construction of race benefited me and others like me, in spite of experiencing casual racism almost daily. Now, as an adult who is owned by my southernness in many ways, I'm actively learning new strategies to undo the damages of explicit and implicit bias in my professional and personal lives. Just checking on my time. Ighodaro and Wiggin consider curriculum as a social psychological discourse of power, which reflects social and institutional values. They continue, a curriculum forms a discourse of power and culture where the interests of dominant groups or power elites are stated and then served through a dominant curriculum, and where, in the curriculum process, less powerful groups are not allowed to enter the dialogue. This discourse of power in educational spaces, Ighodaro and Wiggin refer to as curriculum violence. Because historically, Black people were considered as property in the United States, schools purposely suppressed and denied the intellectual heritage of these groups. Ighodaro and Wiggin contend that the legacies of exclusion and denial of culture are present in education today, a point to which I agree. So how does one make space for anti-racist pedagogy where we have previously failed? To start, I posit that an ongoing and reflexive practice of developing culturally sustaining pedagogies is necessary. A culturally sustaining pedagogy seeks to perpetuate and foster, to sustain, linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism of schooling for positive social transformation. If you made a Venn diagram of how and what you consider essential to teach at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, and how and what you were taught directly or indirectly to teach, where would the overlaps be? I echo Ladson Billings in claiming that we teach what we value. Put another way, we communicate to our students what we value through the artists, the content, the questions, and the processes we bring into spaces of art education. I also argue that inclusion is not demonstrating value. Our students don't need to be taught about Blackness or brownness through inclusion of artists of color. They need to be taught that we value Blackness and brownness as much as we value our whiteness. Sorry. And how are we doing that in a culture that has taught each of us, Black, brown, or white, that whiteness has inherent or superior cultural value? One way to consider is what Stewart calls the language of appeasement. Are we adopting language of diversity and inclusion in our approach to curriculum and art education, or of equity and justice? Diversity, for example, asks, who's in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority? A culturally sustaining pedagogy in the arts would be a pedagogy that makes no claim, among other things, to race neutrality. Race neutrality can be understood as an effort to be inclusive with claims of colorblindness. But what race neutrality does in our classrooms is erase the history of inequity for Black, Indigenous people of color, manifested in systems of white supremacy. Instead, doing the work of a culturally sustaining pedagogy in the arts would include engaging in difficult dialogues about race, in particular, how race can shape experience or expression in the arts. I intentionally use the language of difficult dialogues as opposed to the more common, how many pages I got left? I'm cool. Phrasing I hear from teachers regarding a topic like race or racism, controversial. Controversy implies prolonged disagreement, and difficult dialogues are not inherently prolonged disagreements. They can be, however. Framing conversations as controversial has the added weight of not seeing them as appropriate for classroom settings. Additionally, it's too simple to overlay controversy onto a body, particularly bodies that have been historically marginalized. Bodies are not controversial, but ideas can be. A culturally sustaining pedagogy in the arts would be a pedagogy that is actively anti-racist. An actively anti-racist pedagogy is not simply inclusive of Black and brown artists. Instead, it would be a curriculum that decenters whiteness by explicitly naming histories of harm, erasure, and exoticization. Decentering whiteness in art education would involve, for many of us, filling in the gaps that formal education in the arts left us with. For instance, in 2017, white artist Dana Schutz's Open Casket, a painting of Emmett Till, a child and victim of a terror lynching in Mississippi in 1955, was included in the Whitney Biennial. There was much debate following the opening of the biennial regarding the artist's inclusion of the portrait. Till is depicted in his Open Casket, as the title of the piece suggests. Was the story of Emmett Till's one for a white, successful artist to further profit from? The capital A art world responded predictably, in my opinion, with rallying cries of censorship and artistic freedom. The New Yorker ran an essay in April of 2017, Why Dana Schutz Painted Emmett Till, where Schutz is described as painting enigmatic stories and her voice as high and childlike. After a detailed description of Schutz's career and accomplishments, the matter of Open Casket is discussed. The article concludes, I knew the risks going into this, the artist told me. What I didn't realize was how bad it would look when seen out of context. Is it better to try and make something that's impossible because it's important to you and to fail, or never to engage with it at all? I just couldn't do it any other way. First, to describe the story of Emmett Till's murder as enigmatic dangerously dilutes the horrors of terror lynchings in the United States. Second, the rhetoric employed to describe Schutz, her voice as high and childlike, reinforces an innocence of whiteness, what Kuykendall has referred to as the logic of whiteness, the justification on which whiteness rests. Finally, for Schutz to speak of risks and not on the reflection of cultural appropriation or possible mishandling of a story of the violent death of a Black child brought on by the false accusation of a white woman is inadequate and again dangerous. The very least white teachers can do is push back on the white supremacy of art education that gives us unearned protection by virtue of being white. One of the most successful lies white supremacy teaches us is that we can't talk about it, even as white people, especially as white people. And to foist the responsibility on Black, Indigenous people of color, the imperative for action pivots away from an action needed for all to thrive to an action that is perceived as benefiting only some. Whatever we are doing now, it's not enough. No backpatting, no congratulating. We're working within centuries of white supremacy and Black suppression that can't be undone through a single well-meaning gesture or even a series of them. White supremacy relies on our sense of accomplishment when we include Black artists in our curriculum for Black History Month and do not question why the canon of artists is almost exclusive of Black and brown artists. It's not about right language, it's about working toward just language, to be prepared to have our ways of knowing challenged and to be willing to listen and make changes, to actively seek new ways of knowing instead of becoming complacent with what we already know, to acknowledge that there is much yet we need to do, and more so to acknowledge that we have, every one of us, been fed myths and misinformation about our own groups and groups that we're not a part of, and those myths need undoing. We must look directly at the ways in which the racist ideology of white supremacy, this idea that white equals better, superior, more worthy, more credible, more deserving, and more valuable, actively harms anyone who does not own white privilege. We must look at the ways that this plays out on an individual, personal, and intimate level within you as a person. It's so easy to blame the system out there for creating this oppression, but the system was created by individual people, and it's upheld by individual people. Stay with it. The ability to retreat when we are uncomfortable is a product of white privilege. The understanding that we are afforded when we do it is a product of white supremacy. In solidarity, Courtney.
Okay, now we'll transition into Manisha's piece. Is it already up?
Yeah, it's on there. But I just have to make sure. All right. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be back at OSU. It's been a while since I've been back, so well, I'm even shorter than Courtney. It's really, as I was saying, it's a pleasure to be here with this opportunity to share in our research journeys. And initially, when I was thinking about what I would present, I had a more sort of a linear, structured, like this is what I did, and then this is what I did, and this is how I grew. But a couple of things happened over the past few weeks that led me to think that maybe I could sort of share with you a sort of a rethinking of process and how theory and the work that I've done over the past 6-7 years and my journey before that sort of is leading me to reevaluate what Melissa and Courtney and Vicky were talking about in terms of thinking about the consequences of our work and the intentionalities with which we do it. So I don't know if you're familiar with this. There's a little bit of, I'm from India originally, and I came to the US for my graduate studies, for my master's program. And I traveled in and outside of India and within the United States. This is very ominous. Should I just yell? Can you hear me if I talk like that? Better, all right. So my work has sort of been in between I'm bad with mics, sorry. So it's really been, my work has been informed in its motivations and its sort of conceptual foundations in my in-betweenness of my Indic ways of knowing and my education and work in the United States. And so sort of this, I like go between the global north and the global south, and sometimes I get stuck in one. So there's a lot of issues of mobility and the lack thereof in that. So this map, recently there was, I don't know if you're familiar with the situation in Kashmir. I currently live and work in Arizona, in Tucson, Arizona, so it's southern Arizona. So there's a lot of issues around the border that are very central to my work there. To my life there. It's really inescapable if you have a heart and a brain. My bias is showing. And back home in India, or back to my other home in India, there's a lot going on in terms of the rhetoric of the border in Kashmir. And it's a very tense situation, more tense than it usually is. So I've been thinking about living and working in borders and borderlands a little differently than I have in the past 6-7 years. So just wanted to start with that. So I've written my talk today as a study of my journey as an art educator and researcher working at and across geopolitical borders as well as conceptual borders of social theory such as post and decolonialism, globalization, and contemporaneity, specific to investigations of space and place. And Melissa's here. I hope I'm not freaking you out with my colonized British accent. So, a recent call for papers that I read led me to revise some of my talking points. So I hope you'll bear with me with this slightly experimental, incomplete paper and process. So this upcoming conference is happening at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp next year, and it calls for considerations of monoculturalism. Given the growing conflict, terror, mass migration, and backlash against globalization, and the perceived counter-hegemony of identity politics, right? And what I've been working in my entire career. Hi, I just noticed you. In my entire career since I came to the US has been in identity politics. So the conference organizers explain that this monocultural tendency refers not only to the increasing militancy of identitarianism, that organizes societies along homogeneous racial, cultural, ideological, or religious parameters, but also to the possible essentialism of turning to indigenous practices to frame contemporary art and art education along lines of race, ethnicity, and other markers of identity. Given the strong influence of my personal journey from India to my current location on the US-Mexican border and to decolonization work in South Asia and in North America, I am encouraged to pause and review how I might consider or reconsider the efficacy and fallout of the intentions of my work. So I'm going to, for the remainder of my time, sort of share some parts of my journey in this context. And it's not a linear story. The images and text that you see are images that I have drawn upon in and for my research, both in South Asia and in the United States, and also sort of refer to my conversations with students in my teaching and their work as well. And the quotes are very much from the epistemological and theoretical ideas that I draw from. So in the 90s, before I had envisioned living a life outside my home country of India, I visited Indian-occupied Kashmir under the protection of the Indian Armed Forces because my uncle was a brigadier in the army. Lulled into complacence by the mistily green mountains and the lack of milling humanity so normal to the rest of India, I wandered into the forest with my camera, till I encountered two schoolgirls who told me, "You clearly don't belong here. You should be afraid. There are terrorists here. Go back to the army camp." I walked by quickly and was shaken by their matter-of-fact tone and the dissonance between the reality of the region's violence and the serene beauty of the valley. Sitting in an army jeep on our way back to the military camp, I looked out at the people navigating the barricades and armed forces on the streets. That was the first time I really became awake to the tensions of inhabiting a disputed border area in any real way. Soon after, I traveled to the United States to pursue my graduate studies during and in the aftermath of 9/11. Here I gained a new recognition of myself as a foreigner, a person of color, an artist becoming art educator. In other words, I observed myself becoming an other. I was like from the white people in India, or the equivalent of privilege. So I began to question, through my vocation as an artist educator, how societies seek and find communities of belonging. As Frantz Fanon reminds us, identity is formed in the journey of traveling from interior to exterior and vice versa. The strength and weakness of identity and power is dependent on how this path is perceived in a power dynamic of us and them. As my professional and personal vocabulary and references increasingly reflected my relocation in the global north, my knowing of myself as an Indian, and my interest in understanding of national belonging and active citizenship, what does that mean when I'm not a citizen, became more complicated. I began examining how making visible marks of belonging to a community inevitably creates ripples that lead to exclusion and distancing of others. In time, I came to see such real-life experiences as metaphorical border crossings into territories with tenuous lines of control. One example is the disciplinary hybridity that I inhabit as an art educator. Here, I navigate an ambivalent space that shares borders with territories occupied by the art world and by the worlds of education discourses, as well as professional practices. And I recognize that sometimes as an art educator, this hyphenated self is recognized by both these territories and sometimes by neither. Also, as a migrant in the United States, I live with the threat of a revoked visa, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, no matter how privileged my position becomes. This threat advises me to keep my head down and not act as a disruptive force in civic discourse in my adopted country. So these can be points of confinement, but in my teaching, I have found I can make space there for my students from multiple arts and education-focused disciplines, including art and museum education, art history, and studio art, to consider their stance and consequences, both real and metaphorical, when undertaking civic work. And to keep in mind Walter Mignolo's as well as Tuck and Yang's warning that the work of decolonization must not be conflated with social justice work. I have to admit I'm still trying to wrap my head around that and figure out how these caveats translate, given that our field of art education is often largely an applied one and draws so much from these discourses. Giving credence to Deleuze and Guattari's proposal that space and our occupation of it, both physically and ideologically, can be conceptualized in terms of smoothness and striation, one understands that humans and other organic beings cannot naturally remain in either space permanently. Rather, we move with force and resistance from one to the other, driven to endlessly volleying between adhering to and breaking rules in our modes of movement. I guess this push and resistance, this need to move between order and chaos, normality to freedom, from comfortable or uncomfortable sameness to comfortable or uncomfortable difference, is creativity. Or maybe we can call it control. After a while, we cannot tell whether meaning is held up by the act of pushing up or pushing against it. I guess it's all a matter of perspective, really, and a reminder to guard against monoculturalism in even our most well-meaning actions, acting out of theoretical ideas. And I've been really thinking about this a lot because I was teaching a class over the past few years where we're looking at what decolonization looks like in practice. And there have been some really tense but productively tense moments where there was this argument for the realities and practicalities of repatriation, especially in terms of Native American rights and lands, and sort of the idea of appropriation once again when internalizing indigenous ways of thinking and being. So again, living in southern Arizona for the last 7 years has brought me once again to a geographical border where the dilemmas of metaphorical borders meet socio-political realities of the roles played by nationalism, race, and ethnicity on the battleground of immigration policy, both legal and illegal. I hear conversations every day about ICE detention facilities, DACA. We're currently going through a vote on becoming a sanctuary city. So it's an interesting time. So my employment of post-colonial theory with context in South Asia and Africa are now juxtaposed it's shifting to, as I said, to decolonial discourses grounded in the conditions of Americas, and more specifically in Arizona. And sometimes I feel like a fraud doing it. Because I'm not even a citizen. People say, what are you doing? Who are you to do this? Or I ask my students, why don't you question, who am I to talk about this? It's an existential crisis, what can I say? So these are two classes that I had the opportunity and pleasure of designing and offering. Art 160A1 is an undergrad gen ed course on South Asian art and visual culture. And that's an interesting experience. There are like 100 students. And then this one is a grad class on the art of decolonization. In an acoustic journey, Trinity Minna asks us to consider how to negotiate the line that allows one to commit oneself entirely to a cause and yet not quite belong to it, or to fare both as a foreigner on foreign land and as a stranger at home. She advises us to be a crossroads. Here, the space of representation itself also and necessarily becomes a content in the emergence of form. So I try to do my work as an academic researcher and guide with a deep and conscious awareness of the power and vulnerability I hold as a legal and as well as an academic intellectual migrant. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. In making decisions about the volume of my vocality in engaging with social and civic issues through art education, I also keep in mind Trinity Minna's words, refuse, return. Resonance sets into motion and sustains all creative processes. It makes all the difference. The struggle of positionalities may, in the end, be said to depend upon the accurate tuning of one's many selves. So in the current location of my research sensibilities, in between humanism and the Anthropocene, new material has been particularly helpful in the considerations of positionalities. I also find resonance in research on the metaphorical discourses in art education, as raised by Greer and Blair, in Kaplan's advocacy for teaching early childhood age children about border issues and border ontologies, and conversations about community engagement and social practice, as written about by Lawton and by Garoin, talking about social practice as citizenship. I returned to Kashmir last year, this time with the privilege of political protection. This time, the visual evidence of military occupation and disputed territory was even more evident in the presence of armed forces and barricades on the streets of Srinagar. I visited one of the only K-12 schools in the valley unsegregated by religious and class difference, and took in the holes left by innumerable bullets shot by terrorists who had taken over the school for 2 days in a standoff against the Indian Army. I will be returning there next summer to conduct a workshop on culturally relevant arts integration for the teachers there, and I'm in somewhat tense anticipation of what that conversation on living at the site of a disputed border is going to look like. I end this presentation with a quote from Trinity Minna's An Acoustic Journey. Constantly guarded, reinforced, destroyed, set up, and reclaimed, boundaries not only express the desire to free or to subject one practice, one culture, one national community from or to another, but also to expose the extent to which cultures are products of the continuing struggle between official and unofficial narratives, those largely circulated in favor of the state and its policies of inclusion, incorporation, and validation, as well as of exclusion, appropriation, and dispossession. So just the elevator speech. So this is kind of to look at more scholarship. Sorry, something happened with the JPEG. But really how these ideas of looking at international perspectives in art education, the role of art educators in looking at socially engaged citizenship or practicing socially engaged citizenship and constructing frameworks in art education have really sort of played out in my teaching and research and service with these key questions. And I am out of time, so thank you.
I got it. Thank you. So now it's time for, we have about 10 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. If you have anything how about you two could kind of stand up here so we can see you. Any questions, comments from the audience? All right.
Hi. So first of all, thank you both so much for sharing the part of yourselves that I think is just amazing, and I'm so excited to have been able to hear you today. My question is, it's for both of you. You both work with such, I'm going to say controversial, not from my perspective, but from the perspective of the world that we live in. And so I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about backlash that you've dealt with, how you deal with it, how you move on from it as a researcher, as an educator, and then, I don't know, just anything else about just that kind of area of having to deal with the opposition, I guess.
Well, I'm currently being doxxed by a conservative website called campusreform.org over the white supremacy article. And like the practical way that I've been addressing that is like being non-respondent to the requests for contact. I sort of shut my social media down for a little while, just so people don't start, I mean, they'll just sort of like find you and go after you. Professionally, I reported it to my university, to our university HR, and told them, like forwarded them the emails that I had been getting and told them about it. And, you know, they were supportive of me and told me that, you know, I had the full, it should have come to something, you know, more than just like online harassment, that they had my back. In terms of, so one of the questions I get a lot from my students who are going into schools or community spaces, sometimes about race, because we do live in a place, I mean, I think that the entire United States, I mean, the whole globe is really like racially charged, but the United States, but I mean, I live in a place where it is like particularly a conversation. We have a street, like one of the main sort of arteries in Richmond is called Monument Avenue, and it's full of monuments to Confederate generals. Candy Wiley just unveiled his own monument called Rumors of War, which is currently in New York, but it will come and live in Richmond on the newly renamed Arthur Ashe Boulevard that intersects Monument Avenue. So I mean, there are so many conversations going on in the city that I live in, specifically about race. So my students are always kind of, you know, and we have the issue that many, you know, metropolitan places have. My experience with like public schools in Columbus when I was here, granted it was a decade ago, almost. But, you know, Richmond City schools are predominantly Black, lower socioeconomic situations, lots of students living in poverty, and then all of the counties are white flight and surrounded by people with more money. Also, Richmond City has school choice, which is just like a classist, racist way of like having the white kids all go to the same school and all the Black kids without sort of like the resourcing that some of the wealthier white families have end up staying at the quote-unquote bad schools. So, so around race, I get this question a lot, and then also in particular around sort of like supporting, honoring, and making visible the lives of queer folks in the world. And I have all these sort of like in my pocket lines that I deliver when it comes to this. And the one that I give more often than not, and I actually learned this from Mindy Rhodes. She calls it the pearl clutch. Like, oh, I don't know if you know this. That actually sounds really homophobic. Did you need to say that? But to sort of like do that thing, like I ask a lot of questions, like, you know, like I have a student right now who teaches in an elementary school, and she's like, we had a school-wide meeting about some children's book that one of the teachers brought in because it wasn't district approved because it was controversial, because the family in it happens to be like two men with 3 children that they were raising on their own. But I asked her, I said, in that meeting, did anyone just say, because they just kept saying like, it's controversial, it hasn't been approved, it's controversial. I was like, did anyone say, what's controversial about it? And she said, no. And I said, like white supremacy, homophobia relies on us to like believe the myth that we learned at some point, either directly or indirectly, that queerness is bad and it's controversial and it has no place in our schools, just like conversations about race or class or anything else. And what I always say to my students is, if you march back in there and you tell them, I don't know, clutch your pearls, I don't know, as a teacher, I feel like I have a responsibility to like bring the outside world into my class so that it represents all of my students. And I don't know who all of my students feel. I don't know if all of my students are straight. I mean, I always like, all of my students are gay until they tell me they're straight. Like, that's the thing, right? Like, why is the onus on queer folks to be like, I'm gay, right? But like, we have a responsibility to show the world, to bring the world inside of our classrooms in ways that helps our students be prepared to go out into the world when they leave our classrooms. And those are the types of things that are hard for parents, hard for admin to push back on, you know? And so you really have to sort of And I wasn't good at that when I first became a teacher, you know? But you have to sort of like learn those things in the almost third decade of the 21st century. Like, there are so many moments that I wish I could go back to when I was teaching, when I first started teaching, where I heard people say just like really terrible shit. And I was scared to say anything. I was scared for my job. I was scared. I didn't know what to say. I didn't feel like I had the language. And I just want to go back now and be like, what do you mean by that? You know? Like, make them answer for it. Because they rely on everyone's sort of fear of actually asking questions, or the assumption that everyone's complicit. Like, oh, everyone feels this way too. You know, I have teachers tell me like, well, I don't have any gay students. I'm like, you absolutely do. And the fact that none of your students feel like they can tell you that is a big problem. Your problem, not those students' problem. But yeah, it's tricky. There's not a really like perfect answer, but like the tactics that I use are like just not. My New Year's resolution in 2017 after Trump was elected was to stop giving people a pass on their good intentions. Like, you know, because so many times we explain that stuff away like, oh, you know, they're well-intentioned, right? But like, harm is harm. And the best we can do if we're in community with people is like bring them into a conversation, right? Like, call out culture is scary, I get it, you know? But call in culture is something different. And we owe it to our students, we owe it to our colleagues, and that's just sort of like, it's hard though. So all that is to say it's really hard. Good luck. It's worth it.
Thank you. I'm afraid of the microphone.
It's on.
All right. So I've been in an interesting situation talking about. I've used myself a lot. When I started out, I was very afraid all the time that, oh my God, I'm going to, you know, prove that I don't belong here, that I don't really know what I'm talking about, or they're not going to give me a job, or they'll throw me out of the country. So all that stuff. But then I figured that the best way to do this, well, I don't know what's the best, but it's effective, is to use myself and think about how I embody the things that I would like my students to think about. So definitely, as I said, I'm not a citizen. And a few years ago, when the election happened here, there was a circular that was sent out from the Indian embassy after 2 Indians were shot in a, you know, just senseless act of violence. That, you know, if you're in a position, if you're in academia, or if you're in any position where you're doing sort of talking about political stuff, just stop. Keep your head down. Don't do it. And I did go off Facebook. I stopped doing all that, but it didn't feel right to. I was like, okay, there's, you know, I don't need to be like stupid about it, but I'm not going to stop doing the work that I feel I need to do. So I started doing things like making more visible the ways that I changed myself to fit in, or to not be able to make the choices. So like I don't wear a bindi, you know, to work because. Because I was told it's unprofessional dressing. So I started doing that. Oh, I'm serious, yeah, this was early on. You won't fit, or you'll other yourself even more. So I started doing that. And then in class, I would, you know, that semiotics of a scarf thing, I would do in teaching my undergrads about South Asia, and I would sort of start the class with a more heavier accent, and sort of switch out and see. I asked them to think about how their perceptions of what I looked like and how I dressed sort of messed with their ideas of what they thought I was, and what my qualifications were. So, you know, I mean, I check everybody. I'm female, I'm brown, I'm international. I'm the only one I don't check is the LGBTQ one. That would have been helpful too, I think, into allyship. So I try to make myself visible and think about how the systems make people invisible, even when they look perfectly comfortable and living a privileged or normal life, whatever that is. and sort of, just drop information and say, well, what do you think about that? So I think just approaching things with kindness and not assuming that the other person has a bad intent has helped. And especially like this idea that I'm not trying to convert anybody to my way of thinking or my beliefs, because then I'm not liberal at all. And starting with that conversation seems to help.
So we want to thank let's give all of our speakers today a round of applause.